the Abbasi Khalifa, Al-Mahdi, one of their Khulafa was called Al-Mahdi. Try to guess why. He even pardoned an Alawite who rebelled against him and released him from prison after taking a promise that he would never rise again against him. So he just took his word for it. Now, this wasn't always the case. This was not always the case. Abbasi Khulafa usually showed no mercy to any Alawites who rebelled against them, or even showed the intentions of rebellion. Since their main objective, as you know, these are from the political nawasib, they're not religious nawasib. So their main objective was to remain in power, and the motivations, as usual, were political. A point of distinction, though, that is observed between Abbasiyya and Umayyah is that when the Alawites rebelled against the Umayyads, they would punish that single individual alone without harming his family. On the other hand, Abbasids would extend this harm to the man's entire family. Like they would imprison and torture their relatives to crush the revolution. This is something that Umayyads never did. They'd often punish just by having suspicion, which is also something Umayyads never did. Umayyads punished the people who rebelled. Abbasis, if they suspect that you're going to rebel against them, they will punish you based on that suspicion. Even if you're innocent and you committed no crime. In this sense, though, many members of Ali's descendants suffered due to rumors spread by extremist Shia about their divine leadership, even though they were innocent of those claims. So you'll find like a pious leader, like you'll find an Imam of Ahlul Bayt, such as Musa al-Qadhim, rahmatullah alayhi, and he never claimed he was divinely appointed. Some of the extremists from his Shia were claiming that he was divinely appointed. This would reach the ears of the Abbasi authorities. Musa al-Qadhim would be imprisoned or he would get into trouble. This happened a lot, and may God help the members of Ahlul Bayt in this regard. An example of how sometimes they exceeded Umayyads is that in the time of Al-Musta'in, Khalifa Al-Musta'in, some of the Alawites rebelled. So the Khalifa killed a large number of the supporters of this Alawite who rebelled. He killed a large number of his supporters. They burned 1,000 houses. They sacked the houses of his supporters and took all their money. Then they jailed all of Ali's Shia in Kufa, regardless of their allegiances. Now this is something that Banu Umayyah would never do. This guy went and went after everybody. As for punishing for suspicion without evidence, Imam al-Shafi'i, for example, one of the Imams of Ahl-Sunnah, rahmatullah alayhi, was a victim of this in Yemen. So they tied his hands with iron chains and dragged him to Baghdad. Because why? Because they suspected that he was helping the Alawites. As for Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, rahmatullah alayhi, he was accused of harboring an Alawite rebel in his house. So the police raided his house at night and they terrorized him. Also in the time of Banu Abbas, the virtues of the Umayyads were hidden. And this is an important point. The virtues of the Umayyads were hidden, and many reports were fabricated to dishonor them and lower their status. I remind you what we mentioned previously. They even dug their graves and desecrated them. They went crazy with the Umayyads. They had no sanctity for them. And they slaughtered them maybe by the hundreds. And so at the same time, you will find no virtues of Banu Umayyah. Rarely, like if you open the books of history today, the books of history were written when? The Shia will like to tell you that the entire religion, especially Ahl Sunnah, they'll tell you that this whole thing is fabricated by Banu Umayyah. Actually, these books were all written in the time of Banu Abbas. And Banu Abbas were pro-Shia. And Banu Abbas were anti-Banu Umayyah. And that's why you'll find a lot of anti-Muawiyah and anti-Yazid quotes in the books of Ahl Sunnah. Because all these books were written by historians in the time of Banu Abbas. And some of these historians were trying to please Banu Abbas. So they made Banu Umayyah intentionally look good. Intentionally look bad. And so this is the historical context. It's actually the opposite of what the Shia say. And that's why you find a ton of Ali's virtues in the books of Ahl Sunnah. There's a ton of his virtues. And almost nothing. Like what do you find about Yazid? What do you find about Muawiyah? What do you find about Marwan? There's nothing. Usually just insults. Muawiyah, you'll find some praise, but for the rest of the Umayyads, nothing. So, again, that's ironic. Another observation is that a lot more Alawites rebelled in the time of Banu al-Abbas than the time of Banu Umayyah. Banu Umayyah, how many Alawis rebelled in Banu Umayyah's time? Not much. Well, Hussein, Zayd, whereas in the time of the Abbasis, there are countless, and we have an article on the website in which I gather the name of the Alawite that rebelled, and you can see just how many. It's a long list. Trust me, it's more than 10 and 20. It's a very long list. This is because at the time of Banu al-Abbas, the Alawites were greater in number because they had more children after time passed. They lived in much better economic condition and they had an abundance of wealth. They had a lot of money. Also, the number of Shia increased drastically since the early days. So there weren't that many Shia in the time of Banu Umayyah. And then they increased, and the whole thing, in fact, was pretty much fabricated during the period of Banu al-Abbas. Now, next chapter is how the Abbasis promote themselves as rightful leaders. And you can see that the Abbasis started to adopt more of a religious stance here about their legitimacy. Abbasi Khulafa used the same methods the Shia used to promote their rights and give themselves legitimacy. The same things that the Shia do, like the same things you see 12er Shia doing today, are the same things Abbasis did back then. The Khulafa of Bani Abbas would say in their sermons, Allah has granted us Ahlul Bayt success, which means all virtues of Ahlul Bayt that the Shia preached, whether authentic or weak, would apply to who? Would apply to Bani al-Abbas, because Bani al-Abbas are from Ahlul Bayt. According to all Arabs and religious scholars at the time, there is no dispute about Bani al-Abbas being from Ahlul Bayt. So they'd say similar things to their Alawite cousins during their sermons. For example, you'll find the Abbasi Khalifa has given a sermon and he would say, finally, our right has returned to us. Finally, our right has returned to us. Which means that they believe that they, as Banu Hashim, are more entitled. But they didn't believe it was a Alawi thing, or a Ja'fari thing, or a Abbasi thing. They believed all of Banu Hashim are covered by this right. So it is their right the same way it is the right of their relatives. They would criticize the extremist Saba'i Shia. They would criticize the Saba'i Shia, who claimed leadership only belonged to Ali's children. Okay? And at the time, Saba'i Shia were basically the Kaysaniya and the Saba'iyya. As-Safah, their earliest of rulers of Banu Abbas, said in a sermon, the deviants of the Saba'iyya claimed that others have more right to leadership than us. May God increase them in ugliness. So what? He's saying that they have a right just as much as anybody else, and no one can surpass them or has a greater right, like the Saba'iyya were saying. And so the situation remained as such until Al-Mansur's time, when, who began to openly prefer Abbas over Ali, radiallahu anhu. So this is now they're starting to introduce new religious beliefs, or new, at least political opinions for now. But this is a religious belief they had, the Abbasi Shia. Some of their extremists and some of their retarded khulafa, maybe, held these views. Some of them are more diluted than others. Some of them went far. And some said that Al-Abbas was the wasi, or legatee of the Prophet ﷺ. If you don't know what wasi means, again, return to our series on the origins of the Shia. You'll find some material on that. Then the Alawites argued that they inherited leadership through Fatima alayhi salam. The Abbasids would argue back that Fatima alayhi salam was a woman, and women cannot be leaders, so she cannot transmit leadership to her descendants. So notice what type of arguments now were being made. They also argued that a paternal uncle, which is Al-Abbas, is much closer in ties of inheritance than a cousin. And by cousin, they mean Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. So they're saying Al-Abbas, Islamically speaking, and through the rules of blood relation, is closer, Abbas is closer than Ali to the Prophet, and so he's more entitled to inherit. And since Fatima can't pass it through inheritance because she's a woman, and that is true, women cannot be leaders, Fatima couldn't be an imam, so that made the Abbasi position a lot more legitimate. And in fact, in Islam, it made the paternal uncle in position of the father. So Abbas was in the position of the father of the Prophet ﷺ. So through this, they start claiming now that Abbas is superior to Ali. And they also argued that Ali radiallahu anhu willingly dropped his own leadership when he accepted to do arbitration with Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan. And so did Al-Hasan radiallahu anhu. Thus, he cannot pass a position he lost to his children. Because the whole theory of the Shia, the Imam Shia back then, was that imama is inherited from one person to the other, right? And so the Abbasi Shia argued that, well, your Alawi descendants here, they couldn't inherit it because Ali gave it up. And then Al-Hasan, his son, even he gave it up. So how can they give it as inheritance if they themselves gave it up? And Al-Abbas was closer. So Al-Abbas is actually the rightful heir, and Fatima couldn't pass it. She's a woman. May God be pleased with all of them. So some Abbasids began to go further than this, and their Shia would quote virtues of Al-Abbas and his sons as well, and use them as evidence for their imama. The same way the Alawi Shia did with Ali's virtues, and we will mention some of that right now. Here I have a few examples that I wrote down. They would quote the incident when a man insulted Al-Abbas's father, radiallahu anhu. So the Prophet ﷺ climbed the pulpit and said, Abbas is from me and I am from Abbas. This is a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. And this is common, this is known. So they quote this to show that Abbas is superior and that Abbas is the legitimate Khalifa, the rightfully legitimate divine Khalifa. And now if you give this to a Shi'i, to a Alawi Shi'i, meaning, and you tell them, oh look, Ali is from me and I am from Ali, they'll be like, oh yes, this is an evidence for Ali's imama and all of that. Well, there you go, Abbasi Shia were also using the same exact arguments and quoting other hadith. And then they would quote the hadith where Abbas radiallahu anhu enters upon the Prophet ﷺ, so the Prophet honors him and says, do good to me by doing good to my uncle Al-Abbas. Verily, a man's uncle is in position of his father. This is another hadith. And they use this to prove that Abbas is the legitimate imam. Then the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ becomes angry when Quraysh mistreats Al-Abbas radiallahu anhu and says to him, the Prophet says to Al-Abbas, by the one in whose hand is my soul, faith, iman, faith, does not enter a man's heart until he loves you for the sake of Allah and for the sake of His Messenger. Then he says, O people, whomever harms my uncle, he has harmed me. What does this remind you of? Again, same arguments as the Shia of today, but they're just quoting different hadith. This is because all these people don't even understand hadith. They quote things and they have an agenda in mind and they want to interpret the hadith based on that. There's nothing wrong with these hadith. It's just that the way they interpret them is malicious and is twisted and is deviant. And it leads to nothing except trouble. So I'll quote some other examples. The hadith that, for example, they quote also hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he boasted about Abbas and said, this is Al-Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib, uncle of your Prophet, the man with the most generous hand of all Quraysh in terms of his deeds, and one who honors kinship the best. So, among many others, so they quoted this stuff. They also believed that they were more entitled than their Alawite cousins because they did the effort of overthrowing the Umayyads, and so they took credit for this accomplishment, and that is true. They did succeed where the Alawites failed. The Alawite revolutions were not able to topple the Umayyads. The Abbasi revolution did topple the Umayyads. As for the staunchest of Abbasi Shia, the most strictest and most extremist of Abbasi Shia, they were, as we mentioned previously, Al-Rawandiya from Khurasan. And these people fabricated reports. That's how you know they're extremists. They start fabricating. The same way other Imami Shia fabricated reports. But their ahadith were intended to prove that Al-Abbas was directly appointed by the Prophet ﷺ. So when the children of Ali attempted to utilize their lineage to prove their claim to authority, such as saying that they were the children of the Prophet ﷺ, the Abbasi Shia would counter by quoting Surah Al-Ahzab, in which it says that the Prophet ﷺ, that the Messenger, was not a father of any of you. Okay? When the Alawi Shia argued that they were entitled to inheritance, Abbasi Shia would argue by quoting Surah Al-Anfal, that those from the same womb are more worthy of each other. So they're quoting things in their favor and using it against the other Shia, and they're all extremists debating with each other about deviant opinions.